Hi everybody and welcome to Rontime. Today is the 15th of August, the middle of the month. At this time I'd like to acknowledge the passing of a great comedian, Robin Williams. Understand he was beginning to suffer from Parkinson's and didn't really want to subject himself nor his public to the life that Parkinson's brings. So he hung himself. Anyway, 22 American service personnel commit suicide every day due to post-traumatic stress disorder in most all cases. And yet the federal government insists on enforcing a regulation classifying cannabis as a class 1 narcotic, and therefore unless they carry a medical card from one of the individual states, where 24 states have decided that's a humane way to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or one of the 2 states where cannabis is completely legal, including recreational use, then PTSD statistics and suicide statistics in those states are lower than in the states where medical marijuana is not available as a prescription for PTSD or a portion of the PTSD therapy. And here at the University of Arizona, Dr. Sisley was relieved of her position as a research scientist who had spent several years preparing to study PTSD in American service personnel returning from combat and serving in Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan, wherever else we send them to do the dirty deed that we ourselves would probably not do. It's interesting, wars are fought by old men in Congress and young men in the field, and it certainly has never, ever created a lasting peace. I mean, ever since the First World War evolved into the Second World War, evolved into the Korean War, evolved into the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, we haven't really had a period of peace to speak of whatsoever. There has always been, ever since General Eisenhower, who became President Eisenhower, warned of a military-industrial complex, we're seeing the result of it in that the K Street offices for the lobbyists who work for defense contractors happen to be some of the largest and quietest black budget contributors in the history of lobbying. And it results, of course, in jobs for their districts, which makes the congressional representatives and senators in those districts look like heroes because they're bringing jobs to Americans that support the American war effort and the Defense Department with all of its incredible budget that represents an enormous percentage of the total federal budget of the United States. And speaking of the federal budget, there is a line item in the federal budget called the Drug Enforcement Agency, and they're charged with the maintenance of the war on drugs, which is an absolute and abject failure if you just follow the statistical means. The price of drugs on the street today in America is lower than when Nixon declared the massive war on drugs and in fact made it illegal for the federal government not to release a statement refuting any claims that marijuana had any medical justification and therefore needed to be declassified as a class 1 narcotic, which it was made under hearings in 1937, which under close scrutiny would prove that the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Mr. Harry Anslinger, used a fraudulent artifice before Congress when he lied to the Congress and said that the use of cannabis makes white women desire to dance with black men, Puerto Ricans, entertainers, and others, and that their satanic music, jazz, and swing induced perfectly normal white women to become crazed addicts to this cannabis that was supplied by Mexicans, Negroes, jazz musicians, Puerto Ricans, and others. And in 1937, the Congress sat there and listened to this crap and made it a federal offense, a Class 1 narcotic, more dangerous than cocaine, more dangerous than heroin, which are both Class 2 substances under the DEA's own rulings. And in the 70s, because of mandatory sentencing laws brought about and the enthusiasm of the Nixon administration to control the moral behavior of those dirty, rotten hippies at Ohio State and other campuses where they were practicing democracy and standing up for their rights and resisting the draft, where people were being thrown into combat in Vietnam with a life expectancy in some divisions of roughly 34 hours. And this was supposed to stop the spread of communism throughout the whole Southeast Asian region and the sub-China Peninsula. Do you remember Mr. Nixon? He resigned 40 years ago in August. The only president in the history of the United States to resign the office. And one of his goals in the war on drugs was to make sure that anyone connected with any form of cannabis was going to spend time in an incarcerated position, because this was such a dangerous drug that it was the gateway drug to all other drug abuse. Isn't that interesting? Then no scientific evidence was ever presented that showed the facts about cannabis and the inability of it to form a physical addiction in the human body, so that the addiction is completely mental. Not like heroin, where the body becomes physically dependent upon the substance to continue life. Not like cocaine, where the body becomes more and more accustomed to that state of drug in the bloodstream and its effect on consciousness and behavior. But no, they chose cannabis because you can smell it for miles. A dog can chase you down forever if you have any evidence of cannabis on you. So they created this cops and robbers game to make mandatory sentencing put more and more black young men in prison. And in the United States, where 5% of the world's population exists, 25% of the world's prisoners are incarcerated behind American walls. Is this the form of democracy that we expect people in Egypt or Iran or Iraq or Saudi Arabia to understand, when we, the most powerful economy on earth, continue to set the trends and mandate the treaties under which all these other countries must coexist with us and our power, our wealth, and our dependency upon drugs? So the street price today is lower than when Nixon declared his war on drugs and pushed mandatory sentencing. That tells you that it does not work. So if you will move from a resistance model to a full scientifically supported model, then there are intelligent ways for adult human beings to allow the use of cannabis in many different forms, for recreation, for medical purposes, for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, which causes 22 suicides in American veterans every day in America. These are the people we sent to do the dirtiest job to kill our stated enemy in their own land, to bring about the safety and conditions of democracy. And yet, if you look at Ferguson, outside of St. Louis, you'll see the police state of America at work, not the democratic governing state of America at work. There are no negotiations happening there. There is no discussion of truth. There is no releasing of facts. There is instead enforcement by riot gear clad policemen with weapons of crowd destruction. So everything that we accused Saddam Hussein of doing to his people, short of gassing them, we're doing it in St. Louis. And in some cases, we are gassing them with tear gas. Why? Because they're gathered to protest the death of an unarmed young man who had his arms up. Now, I realize that all of you amendment freaks out there are going to scream and jump and shout, well, if he was armed, he could have defended himself. Really? And if he weren't black and he weren't walking down the street in the way that he was, then he wouldn't have ever been stopped by the police, which is mostly a white force in his neighborhood. So, again and again and again, we see examples of law enforcement failing to deliver on their contract to serve and protect, but instead they have taken a military status in their departments and they treat us citizens, members of democracy, as a statistical anomaly, because wherever they're needed, they're going to come out in full force with battle gear and armored vehicles, because that's how they know how to respond to Americans exercising their rights. Speaking of rights, there are 5.5 million Americans who cannot vote in public elections because they were arrested for cannabis, and their civil rights have never been restored by the courts who took them away for this major offense against society. 5.5 million Americans can't vote because they're cannabis criminals. I know. I'm one of them. So if all 5.5 million of us formed a party, we'd be larger than the Green Party. We'd be larger than the largest independent third party that was ever assembled in the United States. I'm not saying that that would change the two-party monopoly system that is currently entrenched and for sale to the highest bidder, where if you can contribute money, you can get legislation done in your favor. The Koch brothers are a perfect example of this. They're worth more than $22 billion each. They use prison labor to generate a large portion of that profit. They're in every business, everywhere they can possibly be. They're going to make another $20 billion each off the Keystone Pipeline when it's completed all the way from Canada to Texas, where it goes to a refinery to be prepared for shipment to China, where it will be burned with the least restrictive air pollution standards on Earth, and by exposing those massive carbon fields in northern Canada to continual solar degradation, they're actually creating one of the largest methane sources ever released into our atmosphere. And that means more carbon, more heating, and more global warming. That means a sea level rise of 15 meters. And when you think about that, that's lower than the tidal rise from Hurricane Sandy in New York and New Jersey. And we're talking about a semi-permanent rise of 15 meters in sea level. Could go on for thousands and thousands of years. As the Earth has shown us before from the geology that many of the energy companies choose to ignore, these cycles occur on a regular basis, and that right now, roughly 47% of the Earth's population lives in an area close to a coast, and they will be affected by this global rise in sea levels. So when you put that in perspective, imprisoning 4 out of 5 young black men in America for cannabis seems to be a relatively wasteful use of one's time. But in fact, if it were you and you were arrested for cannabis under statutes that were completely false and not based on science at all, would you not demand from a democracy that your rights be totally and absolutely restored for this non-criminal activity that you took place in? And that every person ever arrested under the federal statutes needs to have their rights returned. It takes almost a Truth and Reconciliation Council, similar to the way that apartheid was finally processed through in South Africa after Mandela created this opportunity for people to speak in public about the wrongdoings of the government against them and ask that these people be forgiven. That in that process, a nation was born where most of the grief and most of the atrocities were dealt with by talking, negotiating, sitting down together and saying, we made a mistake, we're sorry, we apologize. But the federal government of the United States of America is making so much money off of keeping things exactly the way they are. If you don't believe me, ask your own congressman or your own senator, why is it legal for you to take information you learned in closed hearings in the government of the United States and go and make investment decisions based on that? If I do that out here in the public, I can be arrested for insider trading on information that was supposed to be confidential. The Congress people who voted into law that it's legal for them to profit off of insider information are the same people who have held up the highway bill, the same people who have held up a jobs restructuring bill, the same people who have stopped the restructuring of the post office so that it stops bleeding losses. And these are the same legislators who borrowed from the postal trust and never restored the money they borrowed. They're attempting to use the Social Security Trust as another one of their bankrolls and disappear funds out of that, while average Americans who are too busy trying to focus on survival and make a living in an economy run by 1% of the wealthiest people, with all of the tax advantages structured for the wealthiest people. Do you think your congressperson is ever going to admit that there's something wrong about them being able legally to do insider trading based on confidential private information heard in hearings closed to the public? And do you think your congressperson is ever going to admit that there's anything wrong with dark campaign finance money, unrestricted amounts, unrecorded, no transparency, no democracy? So, here we are in the middle of August of 2014. The president has a year and a half to try to establish a legacy. It's recommended that he read and sign the proclamation Harry Anslinger Day, which would make April 20th every year a national day of gardening for hemp and cannabis across the United States of America. The federal government would rescind the classification of cannabis as a Class 1 narcotic. The federal government would establish a Truth and Reconciliation Council for every person who is ever prosecuted under these laws, which were based upon the use of a fraudulent artifice before Congress. But it's up to the Congress to write legislation to fix the legislation they wrote that put us in this place. They do not trust the states to be able to govern themselves. So they have taken over the process of governance in every opportunity we gave them. They are now the largest consumer of fossil fuels of any organization on earth. They give stipends and tax credits to the most profitable energy companies in the history of American business at your expense, taxpayer. So, how long can this go on? How long can the president ignore the fact that 5% of the world's population incarcerates 25% of the world's prisoners? It's my sincere hope that these things can change and change rapidly. I appreciate you inviting me into your viewing space. I apologize for having a cough. I don't have anything to do with it. And I don't have anything to drink. Anyway, have a nice day.